Hello, and thank you for joining us today for GuideHouse Insights webinar, Riding Out the Perfect Storm. Are you prepared for the coming DER decade? My name is Matthew Spady. I'm an Associate Director at GuideHouse Insights and will be your host. Joining us today from GuideHouse is our moderator, Peter Asmus, Research Director at GuideHouse Insights, and our panelists from Grid Services are Eric Young, Vice President, Industry Solutions, Jesse Mehrhoff, Partner Ecosystem and Product Marketing Manager, and Michael Goldman, Director, Business Development and Regulatory. We invite you to submit your questions throughout today's presentation. When possible, we'll work them into the conversation, and we'll also have a brief Q&A for additional questions at the end. You can submit your questions via the question field located at the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. Today's webinar will be available for replay on the GuideHouse Insights website in the next few days. Please visit our webinar page where you can find archives of previous webinars. First, before we begin our presentation, let me share a brief introduction about GuideHouse Insights. As the research arm of GuideHouse, we provide in-depth analysis of clean, intelligent, mobile, and distributed energy. Our research reports, advisory services, and custom research provide deep examination of technology trends across 5 industry sectors: power and utilities, building tech, automotive, telecommunications, and high-tech and IT. On the screen, you'll see additional detail on specific coverage within those focus areas. You can find additional information about GuideHouse Insights at guidehouseinsights.com, where you'll find full contact information for the company. GuideHouse Insights offers a full range of advisory services, from technology insights to data insights to individual reports. In a moment, I'll paste a link into the chat box on your GoToWebinar control panel, and you can use that to request a demo of any of these services from a member of our team. But now, let me turn the conversation over to Peter Asmus, who will tell you about himself and introduce today's panel.
Well, thank you, Matthew. Yes, the name is Peter Asmus. I have been looking at energy markets for over 30 years, and over the past, I guess it might even be 12 years now, I have been with GuideHouse, formerly Pike, then Navigant, now GuideHouse, focusing on how to basically squeeze the most value out of distributed energy resources through platforms like microgrids, virtual power plants, and DERMS. So that's about me. So I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. So let's start with Eric. Want to give a brief introduction?
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it. So I'm the Vice President of Industry Solutions at Grid Services. What that means is I really engage deeply with our customers, both prospective as well as existing customers, to really understand their needs and what they're trying to solve for, and bring to them a solution that actually helps solve some of those challenges in a way that brings a lot of the distributed energy resources, either it's front of the meter or behind the meter, into the modern grid control loop. And so as we talk about as we go through this webinar, we'll talk a little bit more about how we do that, how we affect that with the customer, and how we start rolling those programs out to the masses. And so with that, Michael, you want to introduce yourself?
Great. Thank you, Eric. My name is Michael Goldman. I'm a director here at Grid Services for New Business Development and Regulatory Affairs. I joined the team late last year, but prior to Grid Services, I spent 10 years at Eversource Energy, where I was responsible for the regulatory and strategic direction of all of the behind-the-meter customer-sited peak load reduction programs. And with that, Jesse?
Sure. Jesse Mehrhoff here, Product Marketing and Partner Ecosystem Manager at Grid Services. So as my title alludes to, I wear a couple of hats. In product marketing, working with our team, right, to articulate our product vision, also actually come up with some of the solutions themselves and then market them to our current or our prospective customers. And of course, it's easiest to do that when you have a big library of vendors that you work with when you're marketing as an agnostic platform. So I also work with other manufacturers throughout the industry to see where we have opportunities to work together and to support each other. Joined at the beginning of this year, and have to say it feels good to be back at the GuideHouse Insights table. I was running the GuideHouse Insights virtual power plant service before that but I am used to being the one asking the questions, not answering them. So we will see how this goes.
Yes, we will. So Matthew, why don't you go to the next slide? So I always like to start with this chart when we're talking about sort of the changes going on in the industry. When it first came out, we first started forecasting this a few years ago, we did get a lot of people just shocked by these numbers, but it shows that beginning last year, the amount of distributed energy resources, and these are 14 different technologies. They're not all supply. They do include things like solar PV, but it's batteries, EV charging, demand response, etc. But more DER capacity is coming online or came online in 2021 than centralized capacity. And that trend, as you can see, grows over time, the gap. Now this is global, so obviously each region is going to have its own sort of variance, and this might not hold true across all regions, but it really shows that the world is changing and that we really are now in the future going to be relying more and more on distributed energy resources as a key part of our solutions to our energy challenges. Here on the next slide, it breaks down some of those numbers. You can see that supply, DG, distributed generation, and that is not just solar, it also includes fossil generators and all kinds of technologies, wind, hydro, small hydro, etc., is by far the largest category. But the second largest category, and this might be a surprise for many, is EV charging load. And in some ways, one could argue that's one of the big game changers, is these EVs have been often viewed as a challenge, and they can be a challenge, but they're also an opportunity. And I think that's kind of the overall message that this webinar is talking about, is that these DER assets challenge the grid, but they're also the solutions to a lot of the grid issues we're facing today. Let's go to the next slide. So virtual power plant, I'm going to start there, and then we're going to sort of talk about DERMS. I don't have to read all of this, but this is why people are talking about virtual power plants. They're one way to sort of aggregate these DERs and provide value not only to the host, which might install such a system, let's say it's a customer with rooftop solar PV, but also to the grid. So as you can see here, the VPP, what's amazing about it is that it can be fine-tuned to respond in real time to the exact needs the grid has. Now that sounds fairly utopian, but there have been major advances. When I first started looking at VPPs in, say, 2011 till now, obviously that's 10 years. It's just amazing how the VPPs have become more and more sophisticated, more and more diversity of assets rolled into it. And a lot of the key is this fleet orchestration idea. This is the whole idea that the value is not necessarily who owns the assets, but who can orchestrate them. And people often use these other examples like Uber or Airbnb, where multiple people have these assets, but the value is created by the scheduling of those assets and the being able to do that all in real time and with digital platforms. And then VPPs are a lot about trading these assets, how you have markets that enable that. So you really can't have a VPP unless there's a market for someone to sell these assets into. So it is dependent on policy. On the next slide, I'm not going to go into this too much because we're going to have Eric talk about this a little bit different, but then there's DERMS. So here's a very simplistic diagram I came up with a while ago, sort of saying VPPs are a little more sort of a bottom-up approach. It's more coming from the perspective, kind of, I guess you could say, of the asset owner or whatever, whereas DERMS is really, and I guess the VPP is more dealing with the economics of the situation, whereas DERMS is really more looking at it from a grid operator utility point of view and dealing with the physical challenges of all these DER assets, more dealing with voltage, VPPs, more frequency. But we'll get into more detail on that in a little bit. So then let's go to the next slide. And here just sort of shows how it's sort of a journey. Now, everyone's journey is going to be different, how you sort of get to this, but often You're starting with demand response. I mean, that's kind of, I guess, the oldest form of DER being rolled into these VPPs and now DERMS of peak demand reduction programs, energy shifting arbitrage. Then you start going into more dynamic dispatch, real time, all of the different services listed here. And then ultimately, you're going to end up with a more dynamic dispatch. You're going to deal with volt var response and all these other issues. And that's when you're sort of emerging into the nirvana of enterprise DERMS. So this, I'm just kind of setting the stage here for this discussion. And now we're going to get more interactive with some questions. So I want to start with Michael. What are some of the main regulatory themes you have on your radar right now? There's been a lot of talk out there about regulatory change, grid modernization. What's on your radar right now?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So I think in terms of regulatory themes, we're seeing a lot of current policies that I think can be best described as market accelerants for DERs. So at the federal level, you have things like the recently passed bipartisan infrastructure bill, which will provide billions and billions of dollars to fund things like battery storage, promote electric vehicles. Really, that's going to push more DERs like heat pumps through energy efficiency programs. You have if some version of the Build Back Better Act, which is still a little bit in flux at the moment, a little bit in limbo, if that's passed, that would add additional billions of dollars of funding for more DERs. I think what we're seeing at the regional level, we're really paying close attention to how the various ISOs are going to implement FERC Order 2222, because that could be another revenue stream for DERs. So if they're able to participate in wholesale markets, that's more funding, and that might change the financial calculus and get more DERs out there. And then just at the state or local level, I think what we're seeing is more of a push through decarbonization efforts. So you're going to see local programs providing rebates or monetary incentives for the installation of more DERs that can help reduce GHG emissions. So really trying to help meet public policy initiatives. So more Wi-Fi thermostats, heat pumps, electric vehicles, and batteries. So all in all, I think what you're seeing are market conditions that are being created by these new regulations that will promote DERs in the coming years. And one more trend I want to quickly touch upon is just how hard or how difficult it's been for utilities to site and build T&D projects. So there's been some movement nationally, but in many areas of the country where there have been public referendums on new projects, we've seen them being rejected by voters. And one that sticks out in my neck of the woods, I'm up in New England, is the Central Maine Power Corridor project that was just rejected by voters towards the end of last year. So I think what you're seeing, or at least an acknowledgement in some legislation like the Infrastructure Act, that there are sections about transmission in that bill that provide additional funding for those projects. It also provides for some reforms of the transmission siting process. That's at least an implicit acknowledgement of how difficult it is to build new transmission right now. So those are a couple of the big macro level regulatory trends and policies that we have on the radar at the moment.
Yeah, one quick question on what you just said. So, this challenge of siting transmission infrastructure, for example, and that's been around, I guess, for a while, but now that you're with Generac, so you were with Eversource, a utility, who maybe wanted to build a transmission line, is that, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, does that increase the opportunity for Generac with VPPs? I could see in some ways it could, in other cases it might not. That's just a quick question. Or is that going to be case by case, I would imagine?
Well, I think it'll probably be case by case, but I think what you're seeing is if there are all these new DERs coming online, so there's more electrical load, but you're having trouble building transmission and distribution to serve that new load, then what are you going to do? Well, that's where I think your introductory slides are very helpful. That's where you need more dynamic control in order to avoid kind of negative distribution system outcomes. So I think that's kind of where we find ourselves.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Now, Jesse, how can or what can distribution utilities do, given all what Michael said, and we're seeing all these stats about this flood of DERs? That's kind of the theme, the perfect storm. What can distribution utilities do?
Yeah, I mean, that would be my first answer, but no, the reality of it is, right, is like Michael said, the market is signaling that these devices are coming, and there's not little to nothing, right, that utilities can do to stop it. And so it becomes a time to embrace it. When you think about what that's going to look like, right, there are typical requirements, I think, that are challenging, but that we already see with utilities with regard to understanding benefit cost analyses, cost effectiveness testing, right, working with regulators to get approval. And that's going to happen where there are going to be investments or programs developed related to DER. However, I think when you look specifically, right, at building out a utility's capabilities to both control and then optimize these DER, there are really three things that come to my mind. And mind you, I'm in the partner ecosystem role, but I do think number one is choosing agnostic software, right? Being able to work with a variety of manufacturers and a variety of device types, because that sets you up to maximize the future applications of these DERs, right? But it also sets your customers, if you're a utility, up to have that choice, right? And to build those strong relationships so that they'll participate in your program, so that you'll have their access to their DERs for grid services. Second thing I think kind of riffs off that, right, is that utilities do need to future-proof in a way. And Peter, I appreciate you kind of walking through the scaling from advanced demand response all the way up to distribution optimization. The reality is, you're right, every utility's path to growth, right, evolution is going to be different. And so finding platforms, right, that can scale with you, I think in terms of number of assets, right, starting small with pilots, supporting those tens of DERs up to the hundreds, to the thousands, to the 10,000s and on. And then, growing with your use cases, right? So it might be that peak demand management today, but tomorrow it might be using those same batteries for power factor, reactive power control, right? And you want to have that capability without having to go back to the drawing board and find new software and learn new systems. Last thing, I rattled off some use cases, right? They're pretty complex. I spend a good part of my day trying to wrap my head around this stuff. You want to simplify. And so that comes in terms of, you have these utility staff, right? They're already in control rooms. They have monitors. They need to just be able to intuitively get the capacity they need for how long they need it, and to ramp in and to ramp out in the range that and the timing that they need to. So making it simple for them to use, intuitive for them to use, and then also making it simple to integrate to other utility systems. Again, back on that, everyone's path's going to be different. They may want to integrate, right, with an ADMS or another system down the road. And so making sure that it's simple to do that with the tools they have in place, I think are pretty important.
Yeah, you've touched upon several key themes that apply not only to VPPs, DERMS, but also microgrids, this whole idea of interoperability. And I know in some previous white papers we've worked on this whole idea that the whole market's moving to what we call the mixed asset VPP, the whole idea that as long as you can see it, sense it, touch it, control it, it becomes a eligible candidate. So, I know a lot of the demand response companies just started with load. Pretty soon, branching out the storage companies, you see everybody kind of branch out. So you're right, we want to move to the system, which is going to lead me to Eric. So Eric, you and I did a white paper, was it last year? I don't know, the years fly by. Well, I guess it was the year before, because we're in January, on DERMS, fact versus fiction. So I kind of very briefly talked a little bit about VPPs versus DERMS, and then this concept of enterprise DERMS. But why don't we hear from you? What's your take on what Michael said, Jesse said, etc.?
Yeah, I'm sitting here trying to think of what else I could add to what Michael and Jesse said. It turns out they've been listening, which is actually great. I think fundamentally, the DERMS, distributed energy resource management system, and we tend to hate the word DERMS because it kind of sounds like a skin disease, right? It's what we need here is in the industry is a system that handles and scales to all these little devices. And so we've come up with this concept of calling an enterprise system. It is an enterprise system in a utility, just like any other enterprise system that you use, like the ADMS in the control room, the GIS for your geospatial information, customer care and billing, critical, get paid for what you provide. And so the DERMS, that platform, really does need to look holistically across the service territory to be able to provide services and functions to the utility itself. And traditionally, we've thought about this as a virtual power plant where it's just a path to monetize some of these assets. And so if you're buying a battery, today in North America, you get the ITC, right, if you're charging for renewables. And then you have another path to monetize where you can sell some of the capacity of the battery back to a market, right? Traditional virtual power plant, you have a commodity and you're just selling the commodity. When you put that in the context of a DERMS, and now the distribution utilities using it for reliability purposes, things like mitigating reverse power flows on a distribution feeder to prevent zero time delay trips and backfeeds into transmission, doing things like managing voltage down a feeder, it becomes just as important as an ADMS in managing your system. You know, as the charts earlier that Peter showed, I mean, this stuff is growing, it's out there, loads are increasing. Finally, in this industry, loads are increasing. At the same time, energy efficiencies really taking hold and we're doing more with less, right? And so we're in this interesting paradigm where we're getting more efficient with electricity, but we're actually also starting to see load growth through things like electrification of transportation. The DERMS helps make sense of that, and it makes sense of that for the control room operator. How do we give the control room operator the easy button, whereas existing systems might deal with thousands of assets across their service territory? There could be millions of DERs across their service territory. We need a different thought process to solve that problem. And that's really what the enterprise DERMS is really built to be. And part of that is still being able to provide those VPP level services to markets for some of that monetization. How do you get multiple value streams out of a single asset and be able to, and FERC 2222 that Michael brought up, right? How do you leverage FERC 2222 and take all those assets into a market, but still use them for grid reliability? And where the need differs at the same time, how do you break that tie? How do you deliver into a market? But then if the local grid is becoming unstable, how do you modify what you're delivering into a market to keep the local grid stable? Because without the local grid, you can't deliver to the market, right? It does actually snowball on itself. So just solve all that stuff in parallel, which is hard. And our goal is to give everyone the easy button.
And if I could just add one more quick thought on that in terms of simplifying it, especially for folks in the utility control room. I think when you talk about scalability, it's really not possible to have a different sort of user interface or a platform or a dashboard for each different type of OEM or each different technology type. You can't log into a million different platforms and try to schedule something, right? That's never going to scale as we see more and more DERs out in the field. So this single pane of glass approach, the single point of control where everything can be aggregated and viewed in this single pane of glass is functionally what a DERMS provides and why it becomes so important for the control room operators.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. We did get one question here, which I guess sounds like maybe a little bit of a follow-on to what Jesse said. Generac wants to sell generators, so how do you end up working with partners who are agnostic to the generator manufacturer and have the microgrid technology to interface with your system? Does anyone want to answer that one, or it's kind of about being agnostic? So, oh, we have some few other questions coming there. Jesse,
Yeah.
I can start, or Eric, do you want to?
Go for it, Jesse.
Okay, I'll start and then I'll pass it off to you. Yeah, agnostic is the theme here, right? And I think what we realize is, yes, we are Generac Grid Services, right? We are an independent business group within Generac, and one of the parts of our, our acquisition, right, and our strategy with the company is that Generac knows that we need to remain agnostic, because at the end of the day, right, we're serving utilities, we're serving electricity retailers, large C&I facilities, and they are going to want to choose, and their customers are going to want to choose the hardware that best suits them. And so our plan is to remain, right, agnostic. And on the flip side of that, right, Generac, same thing. They have the power cell batteries, right, the generators, as were mentioned, all of these devices that will work with companies that are maybe viewed as our competitors as well, because the reality is that we need to orchestrate these DER to have a reliable grid. And so that is the plan, is to make sure that, whatever that device is, if it can provide the right data, right, if we can send a control signal to it, we will go ahead and do that. Eric, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add.
I think you covered it really well. And I think if you get very specific into microgrids, right? Microgrids, serve a very particular purpose, and they're valuable to not only the community that's served underneath them or within them, but also the ability for utility. Like if we look at what's happening out in California right now with the PSPS events and the need to disconnect transmission for a period of time, and how the microgrid community has been able to stand some of those up and still provide some semblance of electric service to those communities while we're going through those conditions. From a Generac Grid Services perspective, we like the microgrid because it gives us a control point out in the field, right? And so we can have a single communication to that microgrid controller that handles a wealth of assets underneath it. And frankly, we don't care if it's a Generac generator or somebody else's generator, or if it's loads or batteries or whatever that are down underneath that microgrid inverter. The key is we actually want to move the load or the generation quotient of that entity to better help solve either a grid reliability issue local to where that microgrid is, or a system-wide issue, things like frequency response. And so we're very symbiotic, we believe, with those technologies, and we actually embrace bringing more of them into our ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing, because I remember when I started on this, talking about microgrids and VPPs 11 years ago, just like people use VPP and DERMS interchangeably, people were using microgrid and VPP interchangeably, and then you're always trying to define it. So what I like to say is a microgrid becomes a VPP when it sells a service back to the grid, and I think that's what we're seeing with FERC Order 222 also impacts that whole sort of strategy, because theoretically, I believe it's, it can be as small as 100 kilowatts, or that's, I think, I know it's going to go through regional differences, but no, that's interesting, because yeah, the microgrid in some ways helps the VPP because it's already reducing the amount of endpoints you have to connect with. You're just connecting with a microgrid controller, which could have solar, batteries, generators, EV, etc. So I guess we got another question here. How can we move from VPP with single buyer to wholesale, taking regulation change to ISO? I'm not actually, maybe I should have looked at that. I'm not sure what that's saying. Does anyone want to take that on? Or how can we move from VPP from single buyer to wholesale, taking regulation change to ISO? Does anyone know what that means? No.
Certainly, maybe whoever asked that question, if you could clarify it, we can come back around to it. And that way we can better address what your question is.
All right, let's go back. Oh, we are getting more questions here. Someone wants, okay. Jesse, someone wants to get a hold of you. So let's go to one of our plan questions. So Michael, and we kind of talked about this already, the impact of the DERs. You actually already addressed, I guess, the lack of new T&D facilities have on utilities, but is there anything else you wanted to add on that, especially the lack of new T&D? Anything else you want to add on that one?
I mean, I just, again, think at a high level, what you're seeing is this, for public policy reasons, this real push on electrification, both in transportation and really like building thermal loads, so heating. So you're seeing all this money pour in for the EVs, the heat pumps, and the batteries. You're seeing more either state level commitments, or President Biden made a national commitment to have a 50% reduction by 2030. Like you had mentioned, then on the other side of the equation, you're seeing this increased difficulty in getting transmission and even large distribution projects. Big new substation projects are hard to get sited and built now too. So I think given this dynamic, it's kind of what we were talked about, is putting this increased emphasis on visibility and control of assets on that grid edge. So as we see more of these DRs come online, I just, my opinion is that it's really going to be critical that utilities, one, have visibility, they can kind of see what's happening with these assets, what their operational characteristics are, so they're not invisible anymore. They're actually visible to the utility at the grid edge, and that they're able to control them so that they can help mitigate. Well, you kind of think about it in two ways. One, it's kind of a do no harm principle. So make sure that they're not inadvertently exacerbating any existing kind of problems on the grid. But two, can you actually use those for grid benefits as well? So when you put all of that together, I'm hopeful that's where we're headed.
Sure.
Yeah, I think I might add to that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big questions that we always contemplate when looking at VPP versus DERMS versus microgrid versus other technologies is, do we actually know where the problems are? Do we know what challenges we're going to face when we deploy one of these projects? I mean, I've been involved in my career with a large number of ADMS integrations and implementations. The problem to me has never really been the technology. It's been the knowledge of what's out there and the knowledge of what's actually happening below a substation, right? And once you know that, you know what you got to go fix, and that can be challenging in of itself, right? Once you know about it, you have to fix it. At the same token, once you know about it, then you have, with these technologies, with DERs, you have a broader set of tools you can use to fix it. And so with the difficulty of getting new T&D, the answer has to be, we have to source some of that locally, right? Maybe microgrid's the answer in some cases, and maybe rather just having participating assets on a distribution feeder is the answer. And that answer is dependent on the challenges you face on that feeder and the regulations you have to concede to as you're developing these plans in order to be able to get your return on investment on that modernization project. So it does actually all kind of snowball as you go down the hill, and that snowball just gets larger and larger and larger. You need a way to actually dissect that and say, okay, we're going to do a risk mitigated approach into controlling assets on a feeder and or a microgrid in order to solve some of these initial problems. But knowledge is power, and without the knowledge and the visibility of what's going on out in the network, at a kind of a high fidelity basis, it's really hard to pick the right tools out of the toolbox to fix that. So it's a layered problem, and I'll just end on what I'm thinking about this subject is, as we electrify transportation, as we're adding, we're in the Northeast right now, and Michael, you can attest to this, right? Trying not to put new gas connections in, right? You want to build a house, good luck getting a gas connection. You're going to be using propane or electric, right? And so we're electrifying more and more and more. So that means that we're going to have to find a way to double or triple or quadruple the energy delivery out of the existing infrastructure, or we need a lot more than Build Back Better in the infrastructure bill to upgrade just the grid to be able to support those loads. We need to find another way to do it. And this is what, my time at Enbala, now at Generac Grid Services, for the last 6 years, I've been trying to solve this problem.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, you touched on a lot of different topics. I think, these terms we are using, microgrid, VPP, DERMS, IoT, artificial intelligence, they're kind of the shiny objects. So I know here at GuideHouse, some people said, well, we want a microgrid. They've heard this term, but sometimes they don't actually need a microgrid. Like, what is your actual problem? So I think you're right. These things are all interconnected, and just to researchers like us who are trying to separate them and forecast them separately, it's a challenge for us. But for the customer, it doesn't really matter what you're calling, whatever. I mean, we want to have a common language, but that's one thing, is that, and these things are evolutionary. So you don't have to build it all at once. That's the beauty of this, is you can kind of incrementally go down this path. And like you said, end up with an enterprise DERMS at the end. So Jesse, I wanted to ask you about how your company's sort of DERMS product vision is aligning. We talked about FERC Order 222, and we don't want to just, we don't want to over talk about it, but that's a big deal. So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And I think I'll let Michael actually get into the impact, right, that 2222 has on utilities in a minute, but to level set, right? Ultimately, FERC order, I could say 2222, I'm still not sure if it's 2222. Either way, it enables greater DER participation in wholesale markets, right? Like, that is the bottom line. And I think as part of that, it's a bit cavalier to say, well, a byproduct of it, but a major effect of it is going to be on utilities, because as these DER flood the markets, right, they are going to impact the distribution infrastructure. And so Generac Grid Services, right, we work with customers in wholesale markets. We also work with utilities. And so the product vision is really trying to balance all of the elements of that. And I think we've come up with 4 main components to get us there. And so the first, right, is just this core platform enhancement. I think it's what we're talking a lot about here, what we'll talk more about today. But to throw another term into, I won't say the alphabet soup, but the term soup here, right, where customers have the ability to value stack and participate in multiple services, right? Whether it's capacity markets, energy markets, ancillary services markets, and then of course utility programming. We want to make sure that the platform can handle that, what we call multi-service optimization, right? And multi-service prioritization. And so how do DER, in situations where they can provide multiple services, actually do so and provide the most value given the existing customer constraints, the program constraints, the market rules? And the reality is we have a team of developers who, I think at this point I can say, right, we're international, are doing this 24/7. Second part of the platform vision, right, is when we're talking wholesale markets, when we're talking opportunities with FERC 2222, advanced trading and analytics capabilities, right, to support customers who are in those areas. And so that starts to get a little bit into forecasting. Eric and I actually participated in a GuideHouse leaderboard, right, on machine learning and how our machine learning is growing, right, to meet new forecasting needs, to pull in new data streams and make sense of them, but also to pull in supplemental device data, right, that might not have initially been needed to just control that device, but that can provide insights, right, or provide analytics into how to best use that device, how, you know, operations and maintenance, alarming, different notifications, so that both utilities, right, or folks leveraging the device, market operators and the device operators themselves really can get the most value out of it. I'll try to speed up a little bit here. Third pillar, right, distribution system optimization. So again, this is that enterprise DERMS vision that we're talking about, extending beyond, as we've said, a lot of these initial demand response programs, but actually starting to support these transmission and distribution use cases that the three of you have been speaking about, moving out of just the initial programming room, right, and into different silos of the utility so that they have that single platform. They have, as Michael said, that single pane of glass to really orchestrate across the distribution system. And then last but not least, kind of a new component as Enbala transitioned into Generac Grid Services that we're bringing forward as part of our vision also touches, I think, on a question we got a bit about business models. And so I'm using this a bit self-servingly here, but the reality is that, again, as you said, Peter, every utility has a different journey. And so if we think about the whole system here, right, we're talking about the hardware, the DERs that have the capacity. We're talking about the software that enables that capacity for grid services. And then we're talking about the services, right? This more human component, if you will, that's designing the program, marketing the program, getting the customers into the program. And then I think what Enbala was known for, right, the validation, the activation, the control of the devices, all the way through to the measurement and verification on the backside. And so some utilities want all of that, right? Some utilities just need the software today. So meeting our customers where they're at, but being able to provide that turnkey service. And last thing I'll add here is, you know, as we move past demand response programmings and again into these kind of transmission or distribution use cases, if the utility just needs capacity and they need to know it's available at a certain time, right, and they need to be able to call it, we'll do a performance contract where we'll take that work off, but we'll just be on the line to make sure, again, that they have the capacity they need. And so really being able to mix and match to provide, as folks have been saying, that easy button solution. So taking that all back, right, to 2222, I think at the end of the day, it's just, again, making sure that the assets are coming, right? They're flooding the market to keep with the theme of the webinar, and the product can handle however that turns out or shakes out for a given utility or other customer.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. You know, I think as one thing that we've been collaborating on this year has been a series of case studies, including one with Eversource when Michael actually was still with Eversource. And I know that maybe you can talk about that a little bit because you were using the Enbala platform in one way, but then we did a case study with AGL in Australia, which was a little more about the market issues there, not for quarter 222, but more about sort of the markets versus standards. And then we just released recently one in Dubai, where you have kind of, you could say, an old school kind of vertically integrated utility also finding a way to use it. But Michael, why don't you talk a little bit maybe about the Eversource example, since that's, you know, how you, I guess you got introduced to Enbala/Generac.
Sure, would be happy to. So the primary use case for Eversource was to use the Enbala, now Generac Grid Services platform to really reduce peak loads during the overall ISO system peak. And the thought process there was, at least in ISO New England, which is where Eversource operates in its 3-state footprint, the way the capacity costs are allocated out, and then the way that the need for capacity is forecasted is really based off of those singular peaks of the year. So the idea being that if you were able to reduce your peak or reduce your usage coincident with the overall system peak, that there would be savings from a capacity standpoint. Now, similarly, on the transmission side, so instead of a one coincident peak, which is what the ISO capacity market is set off of, the transmission costs are based off of 12 monthly coincident peaks. But if you're able to go after those as well, you have the ability to kind of negate the need for future build out, and then to also have an impact on how costs are allocated out for, again, either the 12 monthly critical peaks for transmission or the one annual peak at the ISO capacity level. So it was really at the outset mostly a cost mitigation type of program, but I think as it matures, as it evolves, I think there are a number of distribution use cases that may be interesting to Eversource. And I think it actually goes back to that, almost that stepwise slide you showed at the very beginning, where a lot of utilities may start their journey more in the demand response. But as you see more DERs out there, as the utilities kind of mature in their use of these types of programs, you see them starting to enable and embrace more use cases and really use more of the functionality that these platforms have to offer.
Yeah, no, that's great. You know, one of the questions, one of the buzzwords out there we haven't used yet is blockchain. And I noticed one person asked a question about that, and I know there's some use of blockchain, I believe, in Dubai. But does anyone want to talk about, like, how does blockchain fit into this, or does it fit into this at all? Eric?
You know, I think this is one of those yet to be seen. How blockchain really fits and how it can work. I mean, the promise of blockchain is this independent ability to basically log transactions on a trusted ledger. And I know the blockchain guys hate the word ledger, but you basically log these transactions and kind of have them indisputable, right? And be able to show that a certain capacity was delivered at a certain time, maybe for a certain duration, and then be able to do either M&V and or remuneration against that transaction. And so I think blockchain holds some promise. I don't know of a project yet where it's been, you know, truly and fully implemented such that it's a public blockchain that anyone has access to. I know of several projects that are more of a private blockchain. And so as that technology matures and obviously the economics get better, then I think it is a viable approach to logging those transactions across a broad basis. I do think there's still some study and some work that needs to be done on whether that's the best solution for those transactions, and it might be. I just don't know that that's proven out yet in a way that, you know, we would do that on a very large scale, you know, in a very public way.
Right. No, fair enough. And in fact, GuideHouse here, we are going to be producing a white paper that does talk a little bit about blockchain and the creation of local energy markets and peer-to-peer trading and how that would fit in with flexibility markets. But you're right, it's very experimental at this point. A lot of it's theory, so I think people are trying to, you know, there have been some small pilots here and there. Now, we had another question here that went into detail about, I'd say, you know, it was talking about New England, but this whole idea of like, how can we have a reliable grid when we're going to be relying more and more variable wind and variable solar? I mean, my own quick response is that's what VPPs are actually trying to address, you know, is the fact that you have all this variability. So if you have real-time information and you can aggregate these other resources that perhaps offset that variability, you know, that's kind of the promise. But I don't want to be the only one answering that question. But that is a question. The person talked specifically about New England, but does anyone want to tackle that? I mean, yes, it's true that people are setting 100% renewable goals or clean energy goals or decarbonization goals. So there are people a little skeptical of all that, but does anyone want to tackle that or go a little deeper?
I'd say I can start at that. And I'd say without setting a goal, you don't actually achieve anything. And so I actually really like the goals. When we decided to go to the moon, there was a goal and there's a national goal set, and the country got behind that goal. And it seemed impossible at the time the goal was set, but it was achieved. And there's conspiracy theories, but it was achieved, right? So we sent someone to the moon, and we put people into space now as space tourists as of 2020, which is a bit mind-blowing if you were to rewind the clock 35 years. And so those goals, I think, are helping us invent technologies that help make it possible to start doing things like synthetic inertia, which the system will need inertia as the actual real physical inertia disappears from retiring coal plants and nuclear that's not being built in other technologies. And so is it 100% clear how we're going to get to 100% renewables by 20 fill in the blank, or not? And I think it's going to be really hard. It's to get to 100%. Getting above 20%, I mean, the old limit, if you had asked me a decade ago, after 18 or 20% renewables on a system, the world's going to fall apart. That was the year 2020 problem for the electric utility industry, right? It just isn't going to work above 20%. But in Hawaii, we've proved that it works after 20% renewables on a distribution feeder, right? And we've done that as an industry by putting technologies in place to help mitigate some of the lack of inertia that happens when you start driving those penetration levels up. So I do think there is an inflection point where it's going to get harder than it is now, but I also think we have a really long way to go to find that inflection point with existing technology. And we're constantly striving to invent new methods, new algorithms, new capabilities and assets to be able to allow this. And so there's a lot of myth behind a lot of those rules of thumb. There's a lot of the old school, and our founder, the founder of Enbala, he used to run a power station. He was an operator in a power station, and he can give you all sorts of stories about how they used to do it. It would blow your mind to think about managing an electric grid today the way they used to do it. But for 130 years, it's worked, and this industry's found a way to keep it working. I think we do have to retrain consumers a little bit. We've trained them for 130 years that they can have electricity whenever they want it. They just flip a switch or hit a button on a remote or whatever. I'm not sure that actually works in an 80% or 90% renewable grid. That's probably more of a retraining problem than it is a technology problem, right? And setting the right expectation and then using the technology to get there.
Right. Well, I remember. Oh, go ahead, Michael.
I'm just very quickly, some of this is, tried and true technology. So, I live in New England, and some of what we're talking about here is, building offshore wind is a big thing. It's got much more predictable load profiles, a lot less downtime. There's been a lot of push to bring hydropower from Quebec down into the load centers. So we talk about existing technologies. Building out transmission, you need to connect where the renewable energy is and where it's predictable to where the load centers are, where the energy is being consumed. It's not a sexy answer, but it's I think the reality of it, stuff like building new transmission is going to help. I think everything Eric talked about makes a ton of sense. It's really a combination. It's in all of the above. It's new transmission. It's utilizing these renewable, the VPPs, the distributed energy resources. That's how we're going to get to this. It's not going to be a singular, new technology. It's going to be using everything we have available to us.
No, I totally agree with you. It's not going to be just distributed energy, even though I started off showing, new capacity, but obviously offshore wind, and you're right. I remember when I wrote a book about wind power, and I remember this is quite a while ago, but Eric, people used to say you could only get to 10% wind power, and people were just saying that, and you're right. People are going, oh my gosh, how is this going to work, and all this stuff. But of course, Denmark, I don't know what they've gotten up to, but it might even be 50% or whatever. But of course, yes, but of course they're in an interconnected grid, and they can import hydro when the wind dies, or nuclear from France. And so that's where this market design and access, the broader geography. The other thing, and I don't want to go off on wind, is what I never thought about is, of course, the wind resource varies by region. So it's not like the wind dies down all at once in one region. In fact, it rarely does. So if you have the broader your control area is, the easier it is in some ways to manage that variability. And then when you bring in the VPPs with these smaller resources that used to be totally ignored, that's kind of what we're talking about is, but that's where there's some questions about, what happens at the distribution level and the wholesale level. There's one question here, we should have gotten this at the very beginning, but someone's saying, could someone just tell me what FERC Order 222 or 2222 is? So we've never really defined it. So, I think we all assume that we're in this world, but just who wants to give a succinct definition of what does it do? Who's
happy to give my 2 cents. So it does go by a bunch of different names: 2222, 2222, 2x4. And I'm wondering if that's causes some of the confusion. But at the heart of it, what this order by FERC is trying to do is it's asking all of the ISOs and RTOs to make any sort of market rule changes necessary to take away any of the barriers or obstacles for wholesale market participation. So energy, capacity, ancillary services, whatever the ISO offers for distributed energy resources. And so I think, the key goals of the order, just because I've been looking at this a lot recently, are to increase competition, enhance grid flexibility, increase reliability, and drive down local congestion. I think the main way this is going to happen, and Peter, I think you actually touched upon this at the very beginning, is in most of the organized electricity markets, there was usually a threshold for the size of the asset that could participate. And I think in most markets is around 100 kilowatts. I think what's changing now is the 100 kilowatts is going to be a portfolio requirement, so that you can have a portfolio of much smaller DERs that in the aggregate are at least 100 kilowatts participate in these markets. So I think the idea is to expand the opportunities for DERs to directly participate in wholesale markets, which in turn opens up another revenue stream, which if you take it to its logical conclusion, if folks are doing a financial calculus on these assets, the addition of the wholesale market revenue is what might tip the scale in favor of putting more of these in. So I think that's how this is gonna kind of play out.
Sure. Well, we're getting close to the end here. Well, I wanted to, there is a pretty detailed question here, but I guess it's, let's see if we can get this here. Well, actually, I think, some of these questions I don't think we can get to, but, we can answer in writing. And Matthew here, I'm asking you out of order with these questions. We can also respond in writing, the panelists, correct, Matthew?
That's correct. Any questions we don't get to on the broadcast today, we will follow up with, or the panelists will follow up individually afterwards.
Okay. Well, we've been talking about these goals, and there have been some people skeptical about some of these goals, which Eric also is echoing some of the challenges, but you also, Eric said, you need a goal to sort of march towards something. But let's talk about 2030 and, where do you think, what are some of the, we've talked about this a little bit, but let's focus on that year. Maybe where do you think we'll be by 2030 with harnessing these DERs, and what kind of factors will determine whether it be successful? How much of it is technology? How much of it is market design? How much of it is just the economy? Obviously, we're having a COVID surge. So is anyone, usually here at GuideHouse, we're supposed to be the ones going out on a limb and predicting the future. But where do you think we're going to be by 2030 with all of this DER stuff, with these flood of DERs? Do each one of you want to say something about that? Who wants to go first?
I'll start out by saying I think we're still going to be arguing about what protocol to use, because I think that's an argument we've been having since at least my first day on the job, and I think that'll continue. I think that's also not a very important argument. I think the argument or the discussion should be, how do we make sure that there's no vendor lock-in? How do we make sure that there's a broad umbrella of
Eric, you're muted. Oh, I'm not sure what happened.
Oh, now I'm unmuted.
There you go.
There you go. You said the best stuff. We missed your best stuff.
That was really good stuff too.
Yeah.
So what I said is, I'll paraphrase because I probably said too much. I think we're still going to be arguing about protocols and what protocol to use to talk to these things. And I think that's an argument that's never going to go away. But I also think it's an argument that doesn't matter. The answer doesn't matter. What matters is that a utility and a market and a VPP and a DERMS and a microgrid and a fill in the blank needs to be able to communicate to these assets and be able to send them biases and set points to perform certain functions for the broader stability of the electric grid so that we can double, triple, or quadruple the amount of energy flowing through it. I still think we're going to be trying to get to 80% renewables by 2030. I know that's a goal in a lot of states and even a lot of countries. I think we're still going to be trying to get there. I don't think we're going to achieve that goal, but I also don't think we should stop trying. And that this is the moonshot, right? We have to try. We have to really double down and try to get there. I mean, our kids depend on it. So in 2030, I think we're still going to be having some of these discussions, but I think we're going to make a technologically advanced leap, much like putting a man on the moon. And we're going to look back at 2022 and say, I can't believe you managed to grid that way, Dad.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's a good way.
I can jump in with that because I like Eric's use of moonshot, and maybe I'm a bit bright-eyed and bushy-tailed about all of this, but and maybe GuideHouse trained me well as well. Because I think the reality is, you know, anytime you go on the GuideHouse website, right, you all paint the energy cloud vision, and I painted the energy cloud vision, and I am still to this day very bought into that vision. And that's a vision where, okay, maybe not by 2035 because we have to be realistic about what's going on, but at the end of the day, we're advocating for a distributed grid, right, a mobile grid, a sustainable grid, and an intelligent grid. And I think the reality is the markets, right, the trends as these DER move past early adopter and become more mainstream, they're going to get us there in part, and they're necessary. We need them at scale to get there. And so, you know, stepping back and being a bit more realistic about it, yes, that transformation, yes, realizing or achieving that energy cloud vision is going to depend on the policies. And we talked some about it today. We could have had a whole other webinar on that. Of course, you know, of course the economics, right, and the retraining of customers, but also just, again, the intelligence behind the orchestration of them. And I think that we are making good steps and strides in that direction. And so maybe it will be less of a technology problem.
Well, Michael, we have 1 minute left before Matt has to say
1 minute.
something.
I'll throw out a big idea, but maybe more along the lines of these transactive energy markets and not a blockchain based, you know, peer-to-peer, you sell your excess solar to your neighbor, but more of like an evolution of time of use rates, where instead of these big chunky blocks that don't change, there are hourly day ahead prices put forward by EDCs or co-ops or whomever, and owners of DERs are allowed to respond to that, and they either sell at that energy price or they consume at that energy price. So it's much more of a real-time dynamic, reflective of grid costs that can happen, that enable these DERs to really help optimize the grid.
All right, Matthew.
Thanks very much, Peter. Thanks very much, Peter. And thanks to all of our panelists for their participation today in this very interesting conversation. As Peter mentioned, we did have some questions we didn't get to address on air, so I'll send them along to our panelists and they will respond afterwards as appropriate. We hope you'll join us for our upcoming webinars. On January 19th, Principal Research Analyst Bill Hughes will be talking with ABB about the growing impact of EMS solutions, the future of EMS. And on January 25th, Principal Research Analyst Scott Shepard will host Schneider Electric and PACCAR in a discussion about the complete solution for fleet electrification. For further details on these and all of our previous webinars, which you can view on demand, go to guidehouseinsights.com, scroll to the bottom of the page and click Webinars. That concludes our webinar for today. Thanks again for joining us, and goodbye until next time.